pleasure to have the opportunity to share a bit of my research on the short-lived South American state, the Rio Grandense Republic. I understand that Rio Grande do Sul, which is the place where all this happens, is not very often talked about. So I will give you a little bit of context, but I just want to get started with a quote. This comes from the inaugural address of José Gomes de Vasconcelos Jardim as interim president of the Farroupilha, the Rio Grandense Republic. What a glorious day for Rio Grandenses who sincerely love their fatherland, their patria. The Rio Grandense nation is, from now on, a free state. Its name is engraved on the list of independent nations, and the Republican government, which it has adopted, will surely make our happiness. And the question I wish to address today revolves on some of the issues touched on by Jardim. Most importantly, how came this territory, a peripheral province of the Brazilian monarchy, to be conceived of as a nation? The answer lies in Rio Grandense's placement at the crossroads of Brazilian and River Plate revolutionary movements. While only a handful of challenges to the Brazilian monarchy took the shape of outright Republican movements, increasing metropolitan centralization was understood to be directly at odds with the interests of provincial patrias. River Plate republicanism, on the other hand, provided Rio Grandenses with models of political organization that became, at least for the provincial elite, acceptable alternatives to the Brazilian Empire. The Rio Grandense Patria, in other words, could become a nation, understood as its reconfiguration into an autonomous polity. This process had many in-betweeners who carried out a transnational debate on patriotic or national identities, not least exiled Italian revolutionaries such as Giuseppe Garibaldi. This is, of course, an ongoing inquiry, so I very much appreciate any feedback that you may have. But for a little bit of context now, so we know the where and when, only 2 months before Jardim's election, when a declaration of independence was issued, the territory of Rio Grande do Sul was the southernmost province of the Brazilian Empire, which at the time was the America's only constitutional republic. This province was a textbook borderland, a badly demarcated land contested for generations between empires and post-colonial states. It possessed a land-owning elite of estancieros, from the word estancia for estate, who doubled as frontier warlords. Concentrated in the rural hinterland of the province, estancieros' wealth was accumulated through cattle herding, although they also exercised a virtual monopoly over municipal councils and a provincial militia. The most influential among them were able to secure the position of frontier commander, who were assigned portions of the border with Uruguay or Argentina and put in charge of policing duties. A frontier command, however, was most often a means of controlling the movement of people and profiting from contraband. Towards the slightly more urbanized coastline, we would notice the presence of charqueadas, whose owners, charqueadores, sold processed salt beef to Brazilian cities and plantations. Access to cheap salt beef was considered one of the pillars of the Brazilian slave-owning economy, and so the central government in Rio de Janeiro adopted fiscal policies that kept meat processing prices down, much to the chagrin of estancieros, because it lowered the price of cattle, though to the advantage of charqueadores. The best example of this system was Bento Gonçalves da Silva, who led an initial 1835 uprising against the crown. He held properties and offices in both Rio Grande do Sul and Uruguay, married into a cattle smuggling family, and was, of course, a frontier commander. His militia, like that of other estancieros, was composed of his rural clientele, which included his tenants, peons, at times of necessity his slaves, as well as seasonally employed gauchos, men who specialized in wild cattle herding. Across the 19th century, revolutionaries and military leaders across the River Plate had employed gauchos in their armies due to their prowess in hit-and-run cavalry tactics. All of these peculiarities encouraged nationalist historians to picture 19th century Rio Grande do Sul as a sort of primitive democracy, where estancieros and gauchos worked side by side on horseback. The Rio Grandense Republic, they contended, was a precursor to the Brazilian Republic of 1889. More recent work, however, has emphasized not only the differences between those two state projects, but also the importance of and the strength of hierarchies and the ubiquity of violence in the Rio Grandense hinterland, as well as Rio Grandense society's reliance on enslaved laborers, who, at some points in the 19th century, may have comprised up to a third of the provincial labor force. Unsurprisingly, the abolition of slavery was not in the agenda of the estanciero Republicans. But if landowners had such a tight grip over Rio Grandense society, why did many of them rise up against the crown under Gonçalves' leadership? The fiscal policy of the Brazilian Empire, as noted, was not in their favor, but this was hardly a basis for a separatist movement. At this point, it is important to understand the relationship that Rio Grandenses, like other Brazilians, had with their patrias. The Brazilian Empire, like its Portuguese predecessor, was quite vocal in identifying the monarchy with ideas of the patria or the nation. As one Brazilian statesman who served both crowns emphasized, governments had to encourage a single spirit of nationality across a homogeneous body politic. It was far more common, however, for Brazilians to identify their home province or even their hometown with their patria. Members of municipal councils throughout the colonial period and across the breadth of Portuguese America described themselves as guarantors of the common good of their republics, understood strictly as their local communities, within which property owners had a say in everyday affairs. The sentiment, although it remained visible throughout the early 19th century, did not preclude vassalage to a monarch, even though it irritated one royal councillor who cursed at the radicals who wished to create many small republics across Brazil, thus weakening royal authority. Two notable exceptions were provided by the northeastern province of Pernambuco, which witnessed Republican revolutions in 1817 and 1824. And that is to say, before and after the independence of Brazil in 1822. In both instances, the revolutionaries remained concentrated in the provincial capital, the port city of Recife. And while they were militarily defeated in a matter of weeks, again in both instances, they presented a radically different and influential view of the patriot and his fatherland. They built upon 17th century narratives of Pernambuco militias fighting off rival European empires, which allowed the 19th century patriots to claim that their patria was only a part of the empire by choice, because their citizens in arms, through military service, had made a contract with the crown, a contract which the authoritarian metropolitan measures of Lisbon and later Rio de Janeiro were said to have broken, justifying their independence. A key propagandist of the Pernambuco revolutions was Brother Caneca, a Carmelite friar whose writings argued for a conception of citizenship that was at once cosmopolitan and duty-bound to the patria. Recife, after all, was a major commercial center, home to Europeans as well as Brazilians. Against nativists who saw the revolution as a fight between Pernambucanos and the world, Caneca argued that all of those who supported the cause of independence were patriots. This, he explained, was Cicero's idea of the fatherland by citizenship, the patria de direito, which Caneca understood as the capacity of European immigrants to become active and loyal citizens of their adopted republic through the exercise of political rights. Caneca urged fellow Republicans and fellow Pernambucanos to abandon the futile and damaging classification of people by place of birth. Indeed, he proposed that to have a fatherland by citizenship was a more noteworthy quality than having a fatherland by birth, since one depended on the exercise of judgment and freedom, while the other was pure chance. Caneca, moreover, was particularly enraged after November 1823, when Brazil's first emperor, Peter I, dissolved the Brazilian Constituent Assembly. The Assembly's provincial representations for Caneca were Brazil's last hope. And when the emperor promulgated his own charter in March 1824, just before the Pernambucano Revolution, Caneca declared, "We are independent, yes, but not constituted," because they didn't have a chance to have a say in the constitution. The repression that followed the 1824 Pernambucano Revolution was harsh, with Caneca and others being executed. Another local Republican clergyman, however, Father Caldas, made his way to Brazilian-occupied Uruguay, inserting himself into a wholly different Republican context. Uruguay, ruled from Rio de Janeiro since 1816, was in the midst of a conflict which had begun in 1825, when Buenos Aires-supported revolutionaries initiated a revolt against the Brazilian occupation. Buenos Aires hoped that an independent Uruguay would join the United Provinces of the River Plate, although the peace settlement reached in 1828 saw an independent republic be formed there instead. During this time, Caldas became acquainted with one of the chief revolutionaries, Juan Antonio Lavalleja. He became Lavalleja's chaplain and was given a job in the Republican Army's press, which published a bulletin with military news and the promises of the Republican revolutionaries. And while it is difficult to ascertain what was Caldas' specific role in this press, some people say he was a printer, some people say he was a director, Brazilian authorities seemed certain that he quickly became Lavalleja's mentor, as many of the Republican promises matched the ideals of the Pernambucano revolutionaries. Lavalleja pledged, for instance, that a national Uruguayan government would allow its municipalities, the pueblos, a word that also means peoples, to elect their own justices, so that domestic authorities would be paternal, known to the pueblos, and created by them. To be sure, Spanish America also had an extremely strong tradition of municipal corporations, and Uruguay's first revolutionary movement between 1811 and 1816 had sought to create a League of the Free Pueblos, a federation of municipalities. In the absence of post-colonial national identities or clear political centers, as modern historiography has observed, Spanish Americans often turned to their provinces to organize administrative and judicial institutions. Across the River Plate, the province, however, was an ambiguous territory, sometimes encompassing old colonial jurisdictions, such as the Intendencia, or municipalities, pueblos, and their adjoining countryside, or both. While in Uruguay, Caldas met no other than Bento Gonçalves, who had met La Valera during his own stint as a volunteer in the 1811 revolution. Caldas would move to Rio Grande do Sul to become Gonçalves' secretary. And while the documentation on this matter remains sparse, it is believed that he fostered connections between River Plate Republicans and Rio Grandense farroupilhas, a word created in Rio de Janeiro to describe radical liberals with federalist or otherwise decentralizing agendas. It did not take long for the Rio Grandense Farroupilha press to resurrect the cause of Pernambuco patriotism, looking back to Caneca's argument that Brazil was independent but not constituted. One Farroupilha newspaper argued in 1834 that in a country as large and heterogeneous as Brazil, the only constant was the provinces' wish to federate themselves into a new Brazilian association. The newspaper then celebrated the memory of the great citizen Caneca and other Republicans. Federalism, they claimed, would bring the prosperity of the patria, and those who stood against metropolitan absolutism were the patriotic citizens. A similar argumentation was adopted by the Recopilador Liberal, or the liberal for ease, from the Rio Grandense capital, Porto Alegre. It stated that the Brazilian social pact had never been so fragile and declared itself not only in favor of the defunct Pernambuco Republic, but also of a possible Republic of the South. The Liberals' editorial board counted with two very telling individuals. One was a Uruguayan called Manuel Ruedas, of whom very little is known, but was deported for political agitation in 1834, and Count Tito Livio Zambecari. Zambecari was a former Italian Carbonario who volunteered in anti-absolutist movements in both Spain and Italy, from where he traveled first to Buenos Aires and then to Rio Grande do Sul. He too became an acquaintance of Bento Gonçalves, serving as advisor while editing the Liberal. Besides attacking the Brazilian government, this periodical put forward a defense of what it called provincialism, defined as the true love that a man must have for his patria. Provincialism, moreover, was a means of identifying the common good as private good, which made possible the maintenance of a democratic system. The Liberal, curiously, took a more nativist attitude toward citizenship than its Pernambucano predecessors, arguing that the fatherland by citizenship of Rio Grandenses was Brazil, while Rio Grande do Sul was their de facto fatherland. The patriotism, he continued, that Rio Grandenses held towards Brazil was based on utility, and it could not match the emotional attachment of the birthplace. A few factors may help us to explain this apparent discrepancy, including the immediate political context of Brazil itself, whose state apparatus was far stronger and far more reaching in 1834 than it had been in 1824. Noting, for instance, the running of elections for the imperial parliament, as well as the impact that River Plate revolutions had on Rio Grandense society. Rio Grandenses had witnessed firsthand, after all, the fierce competition between more or less autonomous provinces across the River Plate. Rio Grandense newspapers, opposed to the Farroupilhas, meanwhile, did not outright refuse the qualification of the province as a patria, but they often preferred to argue that challenges to the existing Brazilian constitution were an even greater threat to the well-being of the province. I probably won't have time to go into the details of this argumentation, but they make interesting arguments based on French revolutionary history that we may wish to discuss during the Q&A. The year 1834, moreover, was pivotal because it witnessed the central government backing down from promises of decentralization. Parliament, during the Regency that ruled Brazil in the infancy of Peter II, between 1831 and 1840, had promised decentralization in the form of provincial legislative assemblies. But while such assemblies were created in 1834, their fiscal powers were inadequate, and they remained subjected to centrally appointed presidents. In the Rio Grande do Sul, the uproar around this treachery, as the liberal put it, coincided with disputes over the provincial presidency. The ruling president accused the Farroupilhas of not only helping Uruguayan Republicans, such as Lavalleja, but also of plotting with him the secession of Rio Grande do Sul and the formation of an Uruguayan Rio Grandense confederation. The president then removed the frontier command of leading Farroupilhas, including Bento Gonçalves, which triggered an uprising on 20 September 1835, the so-called Farroupilha Revolution. Led by Gonçalves, an estanciero army occupied the provincial capital, but they did not declare their independence. Instead, they only sought to appoint their own president and to present their grievances to the Brazilian government, which, however, refused to make any concessions, leading this sudden uprising to become a protracted civil war, which engulfed the whole province. Both sides suffered badly, and a whole year of skirmishes and sieges passed. But everything changed on 11 September 1836, when a Farroupilha commander, Souza Neto, declared the foundation of a Rio Grandense Republic. Neto had just won a major pitched battle, but why he chose that moment beyond that to issue a unilateral declaration of independence is still unknown. Gonçalves and other leaders were not with him at that moment, although issues with his troops' morale have been raised as possible explanations for his seemingly abrupt actions. He did, nonetheless, declare that Rio Grande do Sul's provincial independence had introduced it to the world's civilized nations, inaugurating the description of the patria as a nation in this context. Nearby municipal councils, themselves controlled by local estancieros, issued proclamations in support of independence, although they emphasized the role of municipalities in literally forming the republic through their adherence to it. The Farroupilhas soon controlled most of the provincial hinterland, although then they never made inroads in the coastline. Soon after Neto's proclamation, the Republican army officers, alongside a few municipal authorities, held elections that saw Gonçalves elected president in absentia. He had been captured after a battle, and so Jardim, the author of the quote at the beginning of the talk, was elected his temporary substitute. The newly established Republican government appealed to the support and recognition of its River Plate neighbors. But more pressing concerns seemed to inform their policy, rather than Republican brotherhood. No one wished to make an enemy of the regional hegemon that was the Brazilian Empire. And so the Farroupilhas only got a few nominal promises and quite a lot of backstabbing, although they did that themselves too. Still, they secured access to the port of Montevideo, which allowed some of its cattle trade to continue. Estancieros on both sides of the conflict, moreover, used their properties in Uruguay as hideouts for their families and slaves. Although many of those slaves were freed in 1842 when warring Uruguayan factions abolished slavery in a bid to recruit more soldiers. Independence, nonetheless, radicalized the Farroupilha patriotic discourse. They scrambled to justify not only their secession from Brazil, but also the militaristic state apparatus that they created. Bearing in mind that because of the ongoing war, they never agreed on a constitution. This was best exemplified by the various speeches and manifestos published by Bento Gonçalves, who escaped from prison and assumed the presidency in late 1837. One of his most comprehensive manifestos, dated from 1840, paraphrased long sections of Emer de Vattel's The Law of Nations to argue that the establishment of an autonomous administration and the military capabilities of the Farroupilhas justified their independence as a sovereign nation. Still following Vattel, Gonçalves argued that it did not matter that Rio Grandenses and Brazilians shared a language, a religion, and customs, since the civil war that erupted among them had caused the creation of two nations in contestation. This deployment of the Law of Nations, as far as I have been able to establish, was somehow unique in Brazilian and River Plate circles. Vattel had been quoted, to be sure, by statesmen and clergymen across his region on matters such as slavery, diplomacy, and constitutionalism, but never, as far as I'm aware, to make sense of provincial or separatist revolts, or of the idea of civil war. In Montevideo, I was able to find one similar use of Vattel, but which followed Gonçalves' manifesto by 1 year. This instance was to be found in the newspaper Moeira Rosas, which was one of the mouthpieces of the exile Argentinian liberal community in that city against the dictator of Buenos Aires, General Rosas. They saw in Vattel's discussion of civil war a justification for a war to the death against the dictatorship, encouraging the provinces of the Argentinian Confederation to rise up. These mentions, moreover, followed a reappraisal of Vattel's works in Europe after the Congress of Vienna. Italian revolutionaries, in particular, were drawn to his pragmatic definitions of the nation. Zambeccari was among that generation of activists, but he was captured and deported to Bologna in 1836. And further research is required to establish whether he may have been the one to introduce that line of argumentation to the Farroupilhas. While in prison in Rio de Janeiro, awaiting deportation, however, Zambeccari was able to establish contact with the local Young Italy cell and to recruit two men to the cause of the Rio Grandense Republic, Luigi Rossetti and Giuseppe Garibaldi. Making their way south, Garibaldi became the commander of a makeshift Rio Grandense fleet. In his rather colorful memoirs, he described this experience as formative in his revolutionary career, although he also noted the persistence of traditional social practices throughout the war, especially the indiscipline of estanciero militias. Rossetti, on the other hand, was given an editorship with O Povo, the people, the Republic's first official newspaper. He is traditionally credited with translating and adapting Young Italy pieces by Giuseppe Mazzini for the Farroupilha movement, such as their motto Liberty, Equality, and Humanity. However, perhaps inspired by more radical revolutionaries such as Filippo Buonarroti, Rossetti drew up a defense of Bento Gonçalves' quasi-dictatorial government by decree, arguing that a dictatorship might be required to protect the patria during the tumultuous epoch of revolution. It is also possible that to Rossetti, this seemed a more suitable organization for a movement led by slave-owning estancieros. But one way or another, his rhetoric was badly received by the more liberal elements of the Farroupilha movement, who managed to remove Rossetti from O Povo and enlist him in Garibaldi's troops, where he died fighting in 1842, shortly before Garibaldi himself left for Montevideo alongside his Brazilian wife, Anita. And here we reach what truly was the beginning of the end of the Rio Grandense Republic. A few months before their military capitulation in February 1835, with Gonçalves' authority in tatters, following a series of defeats and accusations of tyranny, a Rio Grandense Constituent Assembly had met to discuss a constitutional draft. No agreement was reached regarding this document, but the so-called opposition deputies, those who opposed Gonçalves, expressed their disbelief that after witnessing the despotism of Brazil, the charter still gave the Rio Grandense executive considerable powers. What this liberal wing of the Farroupilha movement wanted were stronger guarantees for individual rights, as well as a more powerful legislative branch. In their own words, they wished to protect the sovereign nation by establishing a representative democracy. The Constituent Assembly finalized its works in this array, as key government figures fled to neighboring countries or went over to the Brazilian Empire. Indeed, the empire adopted a forgive and forget policy, which saw a peace treaty recognize the military ranks of Republican officials and abstain from imposing punishments on the Republican leadership. On the very day the treaty was signed, the 25th of February 1845, the last Farroupilha commander-in-chief, General Canabarro, called his troops to end the devastation of our land and to maintain the integrity of the empire. It must be noted that slaves who joined the Republican army did not receive the same welcome. Many were massacred or re-enslaved, following fears that they had become not only skilled guerrilla fighters, but had also come into contact, in particular, with Uruguayan Republican abolitionism, and might organize their own war of liberation. Almost overnight, talk of the Rio Grandense nation was abandoned. And while patriotic identities became ever more associated with Brazil and service in the Brazilian army. This has been especially noted by literary scholars working on the later Romantic movement in Brazil, but that's a whole other issue that perhaps we can continue discussing in the Q&A. Thank you very much.